It's about the stories of our children getting opportunity to go to college and about mamas and daddies putting nickels and dimes and quarters together to pay tuition. It's about our stories. It's about the hardships and the pain and the suffering. It's about the protests and the marching. It's about the standing. It's about the legislation. It's about all of that. It's our story.
Witness to Grace, a testimony of favor, is a poignant, true life story that chronicles the remarkable journey of W. Franklyn Richardson, from humble and challenging beginnings to honored positions of power and global influence. Witness to Grace gives an intimate portrayal of the rise of one of the most respected religious and civil rights leaders of our time.
My name is Ralph Douglas West. I'm the senior pastor at the Church Without Walls in Houston, Texas. And I'm excited today to have as my guest one of my closest friends in the person of Dr. W. Franklyn Richardson, who pastors the Grace Church in Mount Vernon, New York. Over the next few minutes while we're talking, you'll find out, for those of you that don't know him yet, that grace is an underlining theme of his whole life. It runs from the very beginning of his life to the present moment. And so I want to welcome and say publicly, thank you, Dr. Richardson, for giving me a few minutes where we can talk about something that you just accomplished and completed for the listening audience to enjoy. Thank you, Frank, for being here today, man.
Thank you, Ralph. I'm delighted always to be with you, man. It makes my day. It gives me joy. We miss each other in this pandemic, but I'm glad to be able to have today with you.
Frank, I was trying to retrace my steps of our first encounter. I can't remember it because there are so many of them. You know, again, today people will get a chance to know more than what they think they know about you. They see Franklyn Richardson now, Dr. Richardson, the pastor, Dr. Richardson, the Ivy League scholar. They meet him as a political force, but a loving pastor. But they don't know a lot about your beginnings. But I was thinking about some of my first meetings. You had climbed to the pinnacle in many ways before you were 30 years old. I think that you were before 30 when you were serving as the secretary of our national.
Right about that, 32. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, Rich, there are a couple of things that I want to ask you because what was real exciting, I can hardly wait to get to something that you just completed. I want to be like a good storyteller and not give it all away immediately. So I want to just do the preface of our conversation. But as you sit down now and we think about pandemic, a toxic presidential election, you think about what's happening in the world, what are the pressing issues that you see facing African Americans in America from a pastor and as a church leader, to pay attention and how do we respond to it?
Well, you know, Ralph, I think we got to prepare for devastating impact of what we have gone through when we get through it. And when we get through it, just as the pandemic, when it opened up, demonstrated that Black people were the primary victims of the pandemic, disproportionate victims of the pandemic. We will discover when we've gotten through this, that we will be the most damaged people as a consequence of the pandemic, as a consequence of the inequity in the election process, as a consequence of fresh hope, of fresh hate born in the nationalism, and as a consequence of a collapsing economy. All of these things will manifest our state. And in the process, on the wake of all of that, will be churches that have shut their doors and pastors who have lost their way, and Black businesses that have shut it up forever. So we need to be preparing ourselves for how we become rescue vessels for those who are perishing in this war, this wave of this current of discontent. And somehow we're going to have to figure out how do we respond to it. But that's what I fear. I fear that the devastating impact of what we are passing through, going through, been through, is going to put us at a place where the church is going to have to step up and be rescuing. We're going to have people who have not paid any rent for the whole number of months that we've been in it, and they won't have it when it comes time that the landlord decides he's going to collect it. They won't have it, and we're going to have to find a place and ways in which to minister to them. We're going to find when we get through this that many of our children will have been a whole year miseducated because their families didn't have the capacity to navigate the devices and the new virtual realities, didn't have access. They're going to find out that we got teachers that were already under teaching in our Black communities whose impact will be exaggerated by the fact that they were not ready or did they desire to become virtual teachers. So there's so many dimensions that are going to meet us, and we better buckle up and figure out how we're going to respond. We've got to be engaged. We've got to make sure we access the powers. I guess the fortunate thing is that we do have a fresh leader in the White House who is apparently more competent and more sensitive and more compassionate than our previous leader. I think that'll be helpful. If we can turn this election around in the Senate in Georgia, it's going to put us in a place where we can really be helpful in correcting all of the mistreatments that Black people have experienced. And not just Black people, all people who are underclass, lower income people in this country.
Yeah. Yes, well, this Isabel Wilkerson talks about the cast, of our discontent. I love the way that she phrases that.
It's a great book.
I don't want to put this, go too far on that because I have something else I want to get to. But what's one thing that you hope that churches will do? And I put that in your hand because, again, people who are meeting you need to know that you lead one of the great national organizations of Black church leaders in the world, where the heads of the major denominations of Black life is led by you. So in the National Council of Black Churches. So what are some of the things that you say as a leader, say, here's one thing I hope that we can do. Get foundation under our feet.
I think we're going to have to re-envision our ministries so that we can become more servant-oriented. Mm-hmm. I think to a large degree, Black churches in the post-pandemic or pre-pandemic, they have, to a large degree, we have become to be served institutions. And our denominations have become to be served. I think the posture that the church has got to take going forward is to become a servant institution. We're going to have to be servant organisms for our people. I cannot emphasize that more than I can, that what we have got to do going forward is re-envision ourselves as servant institutions. We're going to stay virtual because the world will never go back to being non-virtual. Yeah. And a church is going to exist and have impact is going to need to be exploring the virtual reality. But being a virtual platform will not be enough. It certainly will be a vehicle by which we can deliver the gospel and give words of encouragement and let the Holy Spirit move as we preach the gospel. But our prayers on our knees will require for us to stand on our feet and act out what we prayed for.
Yes, sir. Wow. How you mentioned preaching the gospel. How do we preach, Rich, in this pandemic, again, this toxic political season, and even with our needed protests?
We have to read the scripture through a Christocentric prism and deliver a gospel that is encouraging and empowering and affirming. Yeah. People have got to come to us, or will come to us in the midst of this pandemic and beyond, seeking a word of how do I get through this? How do I handle this? I lost my mama. I lost my husband. I lost my children. I don't have a job. I don't know when I'm going to get a job. I have the pandemic. Our finances are gone. And we will have to stand in the pulpit and announce hope to people who are feeling hopeless.
This is where I've been wanting to go, because you just completed writing an autobiography of your life. We get the chance to get a picture of your life through your pen, and word and language and verbiage, looking backwards, looking in the present, and looking forward. And of all of the names of the book, it's about God's grace.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the book. And I want to talk about it because one of my favorite readings is biographical readings. Phillips Brooks made the comment once about biographical reading. He says that when you pick up a biography, don't put the man down until you've completely known him, until he's a living, breathing person to you. And that has always stuck with me when I pick up biography. And what's even more exciting is to pick up a biography of somebody that I know or thought I knew, and then say, I didn't know that about Rich. That's been probably the most exciting thing. So it's clear that when you talk, you're not straining at all to be a servant in the world. There's no doubt about that. This is not cliche language, that this is a theology that has shaped your very living. Where did that come from? Where did you get that?
I want to say that it began with the elementary nurturing of faith and escort into faith from my mother and my grandparents. I think they deposited in me an understanding of what it meant to be in relationship with God. And then I emerged on the preaching scene in the backdrop of Martin Luther King Jr. He set the stage for what he modeled behavior for Black preachers. I never met Martin Luther King Jr., but I was in college at the time just before he died, or was assassinated. And he set the paradigm for how the Black church ought to function as a social gospel, as a social justice institution. And so I think those things come together, Ralph, to shape my approach to ministry. I see the gospel through the prism of social justice.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all the elements. There's a sense in which social justice includes comfort and condolence and caring. But it's also a call to speak to power, the truth to power.
Yeah. I sense that in you, that you build community and church through the preaching of the gospel. That's a good word, that's not the preaching of the gospel, that's more than 30 minutes in the pulpit. I raised that because of your statement in your book. The highlighted theme of that book is a testimony of grace. You witness grace, but it's a testimony of God's favor. And preaching for me, when I read you, seems to be way beyond the pulpit work that you do on Sunday morning.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. You preach the gospel in the streets.
Yeah, Sunday morning is commencement to engage.
Yeah.
Two things. If you leave Sunday morning and are not empowered to act out what you preached, then you will be totally ineffective.
Mama.
And if you leave the week and go to Sunday morning and have not been engaging, you won't have nothing to say. The real issue is if you are committed to what you say, or are you performing?
Mama, yeah.
Are you committed to what you are preaching? And if you're committed to what you're preaching, you have no alternative. Otherwise, you have to accept that you're the biggest imposter and hypocrite on the planet.
Yeah.
If you can preach on Sunday morning and ignore the mandates that are in the preaching you have provided, then you have been an imposter.
Yeah. When I read your book, I ask myself, how do I want to read Richardson's story? Tell me 2 or 3 ways for the layperson that's going to purchase your book and they're going to read your story, how do they read it?
Mm-hmm.
Or the pastor or the preacher or the activist, when they read it, how do they read it? And then as we read, the writer always has clues in there to say, while you're reading, make sure you pay attention to these statements I make throughout this book, but this helps you understand my person, my theology, and my moral vision for the world. How would you say, read this book this way?
The first thing, the first answer, I would say to the book must be read by young people or those developing their lives as saying you don't have to let where you came from determine where you're going. That you can overcome whatever inadequacies that you have, and you can overcome whatever conflicts and disappointments that you make in your life. You can overcome them. You can rise above your social context. You can succeed. And that's the way I want young people to read it. I want them to be encouraged.
Yeah.
You know, because I started at the ground zero.
Yeah.
And God escorted me to the high places, the pinnacles of the global village.
Yeah.
But it was his grace.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the great things about my approach. What drove me to this book is that I wanted to be able to identify for those who come behind me where grace was evident in my life. It's one thing to say, I come this far by grace. It's another thing to point to it.
My Lord.
And the book provides a chance for me to point to how I came through by the grace. So one way you read it is that way.
Yeah.
Then you read it as a pastor. You know, as pastors, we don't just live our lives in the spotlight of the pulpit. Mm-hmm. We, like the people in the pew, live our lives in the shadows of disappointment, betrayal, and frustration. We live our lives in the tensions of failure and success. And I wanted to share that because I know fellow pastors that go through that. I want to share how you get mad at God. That's one of the chapters in my book. You get mad at God.
Right.
How you get frustrated. You can't figure God out. And then one of the things I say is that your goal, when you go down the road in life as a pastor, as a minister, even as a person of faith, you go forward in faith, looking down the road to where you want to go. And by faith, you're pursuing the destination. Sometimes it's not clear. Sometimes faith takes you into darkness. But by faith, you seek your purpose.
Yeah.
But you cannot see grace going down the road. Yeah. You can only see grace looking back over your shoulder and seeing what God brought you through.
Yes.
So for me, grace is my ability to reflect and interpret God's fingerprint on my life.
Yeah. Listen, you know, we could go on and on about this. But I think that's a great way to end our conversation. We could talk all day, but to be respectful of the time. But thank you for that. I think that's a high note to end our conversation on. I want to encourage all of our listeners to pick up a copy of W. Franklyn Richardson's book. It'll bless your life. It's a witness to grace. His life actually bespeaks what a witness to grace looks like. It's a testimony of the very favor of God. It's biographical, or should I say autobiographical, and it traces his beginning till now. But along the way, he points out the different signs of God's grace, even when it appeared that grace was not there. And I think for me, the peak chapter is when you get angry with God. The pieces of wisdom that you leave in there is theologically robust to remind us that those days come, but it doesn't mean that God is not there, man.
Yes,
so
sir.
Thank you for that. Get a copy of Dr. W. Franklyn Richardson's book, read it, and I certainly say to our leaders to read it, whether religious, political, social, educational, atheist, agnostic, you know, in between, I really mean that, is to read it. Biographical reading is always to be read wisely and broadly and deeply, and so it's rich. And I know you, but I really get to know you on a different level through reading your life story. Thank you for sharing and being vulnerable enough to share your life story with us. Praise God for you, Rich.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me, Ralph. And it's just a pleasure always to be in your presence.
Grace. Grace.